Serious. Nurses, hospital workers of Reddit, what is the most paranormal weirdest thing you have ever experienced while working? I'm a sterile processing tech at a fairly average-sized hospital, about 180 beds. I've been working here for 4 years, and I worked the graveyard for 8 months. My aunt used to work in transportation, graveyard as well. One night, I saw her in the basement. I thought it was her, so I tried to catch up. She must have been 12, maybe 15 feet ahead of me. She kept on walking, only she sped up. I called her name, but she wouldn't turn and just kept on walking faster and faster, so I figured maybe she doesn't want to see me. She made a right turn onto another long hallway with only about 2 doors on the left side of it. Other than that, it was a fairly empty hallway with no other places where she could have hidden. It connects the main hospital with the doctor's offices building. I kept on following her because it honestly intrigued me as to why she was going that way, since this building is closed, and also because I wanted to know why she was acting so fleabing weird. When I turned, I thought she was gonna jump scare me or something, but she was gone. There was no one there. What boggled my freaking head was that I just walked back to the cafeteria and there she was sitting. I soiled my pants because there was no way a lady in her 40s is gonna beat me through the only route from that point in the hospital to the cafeteria and be sitting there eating. I could have sworn it was her. Even if it wasn't my aunt, there was no one else that looks like her in the hospital, let alone another transport wearing the uniform, since she was the only woman of her department at 3 a.m. I still try to make sense of the whole thing, but I just can't figure it out. I am an RN and have had my share of odd happenings. One of the creepiest took place on the night shift at a hospital in Texas. I was caring for a man who was dying from liver failure. He was fairly young and his mother and girlfriend had been staying at his bedside for days. He was nearing death and had been unresponsive for days. Late one night, I realized he was going to die shortly and woke his mom and girlfriend so they could say their goodbyes. His girlfriend sat next to his bed to hold his hand. Suddenly the man, who had been completely unresponsive for days, sits upright in bed with the most terrified expression I have ever seen. His eyes were huge and terror-filled, his mouth was curled into what I can only describe as silent shrieking, and he was staring up at a ceiling corner. His girlfriend of course was thrilled, thinking that he was suddenly okay. She puts her hands on his head and tries to turn his head towards her so he could see her. She's telling him she loves him and to look at her, but he just continues to have the most bone-chilling look of pure fear on his face. When she manages to turn his head, his eyes continue to focus on the same spot on the ceiling. So there she is, holding his face towards her, shrieking at her to look at her, but he won't take his eyes off the same spot on the ceiling in the corner. And then he just simply fell back and died. It was awful. My mom used to be a RN at a hospital in a small western town. This hospital was connected to a senior living home, and at night, the RN overwatched both sides of the building, hospital and living home. She was usually the overnight RN and would have either 1 or 2 CNAs working as well. She has experienced this apparition about 6 or 7 times during her 10-year stint there, and everyone has referred to the apparition as the man in black. Each experience was identical except for the location in the building. Frequently throughout the night, she would have to do her rounds, checking vitals, etc., and would have to walk around a corner from the nurses' station towards the 6 beds in the hospital and towards the senior home. She would see the apparition either right after rounding the corner or right after walking out of a room and walking to the next. Outside of the next room, she would see the same apparition. The apparition was of a person in a black Old West type suit with worn black cowboy boots and worn black cowboy hat to match. The creepiest thing about this man, assuming, is that his face was not very distinct. She would describe it as though a man's face was drawn with charcoal and slightly smeared, making it slightly blurred. He was about 6'5" and would tower over her 5'5". But whenever she would see him, whether it's 10 feet or 3 feet away, he would stand there looking at her and then turn and walk into the room he was outside of. When she would walk into that room, there would not be any other person in there or anything out of place. The first few times scared her to a panic, but she slowly just went on without letting it freak her out. But with this man came some extra attention to the patient. The kicker was that, in about 90% of all the experiences seen by other RNs as well, the patient's health would deteriorate in the next few days, and the patient most often passed away shortly after. So, whenever the overnight RN saw the man in black, extra precautions would be taken with that patient. Another weird thing about the apparition is that it is always seen by just the RN. Not a single CNA has personally seen the apparition. My mom always said that he knew who would be able to help the most at the time. I, on the other hand, took it as the completely opposite. I always thought that it was almost to mock the RNs because he would let them know that something was going to happen, but they could not do anything about it. Even though I am not an RN to see him, it still creeps me out every time I walk down the halls and she points out where she has seen him. I work night shift as a CNA in a hospital. I had a patient last year. He was in his 50s, totally with it. I had him for a week or two and never showed signs of confusion at night or otherwise. He liked to keep his door open at all times, and he was in a room close to the nurse's station, so he saw myself and plenty other staff walk by throughout the night. One night, around 2:30 in the morning, he sees me walking by and calls me into his room. "Is that your son or something?" "Who?" I asked. "The little boy that's been following you all night." I proceeded to ask what he looked like because I could not see him. He said he looked to be about 7 years old, with short dark hair and a baseball cap. Both of us were freaked out about the situation, and he requested to keep his lights on after that. I'm getting chills thinking about it now. I posted this a while back while I was still a lab assistant. As a nurse, I have never had a scarier experience. I had worked in a hospital for almost 7 years then, and I've seen the life leave people's bodies and felt a presence connection with people, but I've only had one experience that truly terrified me. I used to work nights, thinking about a large dark hospital full of quiet sleeping people is kind of creepy, but I never felt that way. My job is to wake people up and draw their vital fluid. I know I'm super popular at the hospital. There has always been a wing of the hospital that make me uneasy. I'm an amazingly upbeat person. I love my job and the patients. But the minute I walk onto that wing, I'm uneasy and something makes me look over my shoulder and want to leave. So one morning around 0300, I go onto this wing to stick a patient, feeling queasy. I walk into the patient's room, not knocking because it's so late. The lights are all off and I see someone standing in the far corner away from me. I'm immediately taken aback, but quickly think it's a nurse hanging vital fluid or something. I look at the figure and ask, "Do you need me to come back?" No response. It turns towards the corner and just stands there with its back to me. My whole body is on edge, and I have never felt so scared in my life. I knew without a doubt it wasn't a nurse. I back out of the room and walk towards the nurse's station. I just lean against a wall trying to catch my breath as a nurse asks if I'm going to be sick. I had to go back into the patient's room and draw her vital fluid. This time, I turned on the lights before I even stepped in. Of course no one was there except for the sleeping old lady. I quickly drew her vital fluid trying to ignore the sinking feeling that I had. I hate that wing, and that room will forever give me the tingles when I have to go in it. It's been years, but I won't forget it. There was a psych facility I was working knock shifts at, and there was slamming doors and tapping on the floor above by a broom handle or something like a stick. I kept thinking that locked unit above must be the most intense and never have a dull moment. Then at 3 or 4 a.m. one morning, doors kept slamming, and I told one of the docs I'm gonna go up there and see what all the commotion is about because it's waking patients up on my floor. His reply startled me quite a bit. The doctor told me, "What floor above us?" "We are on the 4th floor, there is no other floor above us." I was shocked and he said he had reported the noises as have others to maintenance, but they said there is nothing on the roof that was making noise or could make any noise. I don't work there anymore. I was working a night shift, looking after one patient who needed supervision due to his hallucinations. This patient had a routine where he would like to go out for a cigarette every hour. I took him out on a wheelchair for a cigarette which seemed to increase his hallucinations. I had been taking this patient out multiple times during the night. At around midnight, I took him outside for his last cigarette before going to sleep. Once we were outside, he asked me if I could see a small ginger boy trying to get out of the locked cafe in front of us. I said no as I did with all of his hallucinations. This seemed to help reduce the length of time they appeared for. He then informed me he could see a man and a dog running towards us. This is the dead of night with no one around in the hospital. There was no man or dog. However, when the automatic doors 50 meters behind us opened with no one in sight, I was no longer sure if they were just hallucinations. I moved us back to the ward very quickly after that. My mother trained as a nurse at the Old Westminster Teaching Hospital in London in the 1950s. On one of her first night shifts, she was doing rounds in the children's ward. Everything was fine, all the kids were asleep, but in one of the rooms, she found the sink faucet running, which was a bit weird because it had been fine when she'd been by a few minutes before. She figured that one of the kids had got up and been thirsty or something, turned it off, and carried on with the rounds. When her shift was over, she checked out with the matron, who asked if she had anything to report. She said there was nothing, except that someone had left a faucet on in one of the rooms. The matron looked horrified and gasped out, "Oh no." She then explained that the ward was haunted by a ghost which washed its hands, leaving the faucet running whenever a child was going to die. My mother laughed this off, pointed out that none of the kids in the ward were seriously ill and went home. When she came in for her shift the next evening, she discovered that a previously perfectly fine child in that room had a sudden seizure and died only a few hours after she'd found the open faucet. When I first started out as a CNA, I worked for a nursing home on the very outer rim of the Minneapolis-St. Paul suburbs. This nursing home was rumored to have a resident ghost known as the Pink Lady. Her actual name escapes me at the moment. She was a resident that had passed some 10 to 15 years before I had began working there. I almost exclusively worked the evening shift, but I did pick up nights from time to time. This particular night, I was working the east side of the building. I was doing my rounds, and as I came out of a room, I saw at the end of the hall, in the lounge area, a woman in a pink robe. None of the residents on that wing were as ambulatory as this woman was, especially with no assistance. As I made my way to her, because patient safety, she made her way to a room. I followed after her and she had simply vanished. The resident in the room was fast asleep and male. I asked one of the nurses about it, and they told me the story. Apparently, the Pink Lady when she was alive was physically healthy but had some major cognitive issues and wouldn't sleep at night. She spent the nights pacing up and down the hall in her pink robe. This place was also known to have disembodied voices in the supply closets when the doors were shut and something in the basement. I never did follow up on that one. Worked in an SNF for a little over 2 years as an LVN. Some strange things that were too odd to be just coincidence was that the residents that were close to passing or not in good shape of recover would always, and I mean always, would complain about children in their room making too much noise. As soon as a patient started complaining of that, it was always expected with us nurses like keep a close eye on them because like clockwork a few days later or even a couple weeks, those patients would pass. There were instances where some CNA would see children in the facility late night, next morning, a resident expires. It's crazy, man. Another instance I had to write up a change of condition because late night, a patient who's usually alert and oriented ×3 became extremely hysterical. I asked the patient what was wrong, and she said there was an older woman crawling on the floor towards her bed. Because this is an unlikely occurrence, we have to let the doctor know that resident might need some tests done such as UA to rule out UTIs and other infection that can cause confusion. It was an eerie charting, resident states women crawling on the floor towards her. For the last 4 years, I've worked summers and weekends at a nursing home in my hometown. 2 years ago, we had a married couple in their 90s, he was 95, she was 96. I always found them adorable. They spent their entire days together, and it was clear to me from the first day I met them just how much they cared for and depended on one another. She always waited for him at the table so they could have breakfast together and made sure the staff made his coffee the way he liked it. They slept in separate rooms because he was suffering from relatively mild dementia and would occasionally get up during the night, confused, which disturbed his sleep. Yet they would always end the day sitting in her room, drinking tea and talking before we helped him to his room to go to sleep. A few months after celebrating their iron anniversary, 70 years, the husband died. It wasn't really unexpected, as he had been sick for a few weeks, and the nurses knew he wouldn't recover. 2 weeks later, his wife got weaker and mostly stayed in her bed. Now, she was not demented at all. At times, she seemed brighter than me, she kicked my butt at crosswords, which is why something that happened while she was on her deathbed creeped me the flurbo out. I was in her room helping her adjust her blankets near the end of my shift, around 10 p.m. She had been sleeping before I came in to check on her, so the room was dark. She had complained about being cold, so I closed and locked the window. As usual, we were making small talk when suddenly she went silent, looked towards the door and said, "John?" Her husband's name. "John, is that you?" "No, John, wait." Then the door to her room slammed shut at a tremendous force. I honestly do not believe in ghosts or anything similar. I'm not a very spiritual person. Yet that terrified the flurbo out of me. I had just closed her window, and all doors in the nursing home automatically closes and locks at 8 p.m. There's no way it was the wind. I only worked with 4 other people that night, all of whom were in the staff room at the time. All other patients who might be able to walk around on their own were sleeping. There was literally no one nearby. She barely seemed to notice, not even jumping from the loud noise the door made, and told me, "It's okay, you can leave now. Good night." She died 2 days later, in her sleep. I barely ever tell anyone about this because I never thought anyone would believe me. And because to this day, I don't understand what happened, and it creeps me out. Obligatory, not my story but my friend's story. He worked at a mental institute as a nurse and told me that everyone is fine till the sun goes down. The sundown syndrome, as he likes to call it. There was an old man in one of his wards who kept complaining that his slippers were missing at night. Apparently, a small ghost child would come into his room and take them. So my friend brushed it off as the old man taking off his slippers and forgetting to put them back on when he left the room. So one night, he purposely led the old man back from the rec room, ensuring that the old man had his slippers on. Upon leaving the old man at his bed, he checked that the slippers were there. So my friend left the old man and went back to tidy up the rec room. Like switching off the TVs, clearing the books, when he just felt a weird feeling. He turned around and lo and behold, behind him, placed at the foot of the chair, as if someone sat down and curled their legs up on the chair, were the pair of slippers. He noped the heck out of there immediately.